Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Osip Mandelstam. Mandelstam is not in our textbook, but he's such an important figure that I decided we had to discuss him. So this is the lecture on him, and the readings are in a handout that you can find in the same folder. Osip, or Józef as he was originally named, Emilievich Mandelstam was born into a Polish-Jewish family in Warsaw. So this makes him unusual. He's the first Jewish writer that we've read. And the family was living in the Warsaw area when he was born, but they were a prosperous merchant family, and they were allowed to leave the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement was a region in the western portion of the Russian Empire where Jews were allowed to live. And Jews had considerable restrictions placed on them in the Russian Empire. They were only allowed to live in certain areas, and there were quotas on how many of them could enter institutions of higher education. But this family, the Mandelstam family, was well-to-do enough and well-connected enough that they were allowed to leave the Pale of Settlement. And in 1897, they moved to St. Petersburg. So Mandelstam lived in St. Petersburg starting at an early age and became one of the major St. Petersburg writers. And we'll see as we go through his writing that St. Petersburg and the St. Petersburg culture and the St. Petersburg milieu played a huge part in his career and in his subject matter in his poetry. Mandelstam was very talented from an early age, like many of the poets. Just as a side note, poetic talent often seems to manifest itself quite early, and so we have these very talented and precocious poets like Mandelstam, Akhmatova, Tsvetaeva, Pushkin, Lermontov. Pretty much all of the major poets manifested their talent when they were in their early teens, if not earlier. And Mandelstam was no exception. He was already getting published when he was in his teens. Prose, on the other hand, tends to be written later, and prose talent tends to manifest itself later. So if you remember, for example, Tolstoy, he kind of messed around in high school and college. He did write some important things early on, but all of his major works, like all of Dostoevsky's really major works, were written when he was in his 40s, 50s, and later. But Mandelstam, although he also wrote some important prose, was primarily a poet and manifested his poetic talent quite early and his general educational talent quite early. He went to one of the top schools in St. Petersburg, and while he was still a teenager, he then studied at the Sorbonne in Paris. He studied there for a little while, and then he went on to the University of Heidelberg in Germany before returning to St. Petersburg and attending the University of St. Petersburg. Also, like many poets, he had all this talent, but had a hard time buckling down and finishing programs and things imposed from the outside. So he studied at all of these famous schools, but never actually completed his degree. The University of St. Petersburg had a quota on the number of Jewish students who were allowed into it, and so he converted to Methodism in order to be allowed to study there. And this is something that we'll see in his poetry, although he is one of Russia's first and most important Jewish poets, his topic matter is decidedly Christian. He rarely wrote stuff that you could put your finger on and say, yes, that's definitely Jewish. Unlike Isaac Babel, whom I sincerely hope we'll get to soon. But Isaac Babel was another major Jewish writer from about the same period, and Babel specifically focused on Jewish topics, Jewish themes, and Jewish characters. Mandelstam seems to have actually converted to Methodism or something like it, as we'll see, for example, in the poem The Lutheran. But he wrote decidedly cosmopolitan, but also Christian-oriented poetry and work in general, as you can see by his concentration on things like Notre Dame Cathedral or Hagia Sophia Cathedral, Lutheranism, and so on and so forth. While he was at the Sorbonne, Mandelstam met Nikolai Gumilyov, who was also studying at the Sorbonne and living in Paris. And Mandelstam, in between his time in Paris and Heidelberg, had spent time in St. Petersburg and had originally hung out with the symbolist crowd, but through his friendship with Gumilyov, he became part of the Guild of Poets and became one of the founders of Acmeism. And his first major collection of poetry, Kamen, or Stone, which was published in 1913 and then republished in 1916 and 1923 with new poems each time, is considered to be one of the first and finest examples of Acmeist poetry. And everything that we're reading for this class is from Kamen. During this period, during the 1910s, when he was part of the Tsech Poetov, the Guild of Poets, he had close friendships with Anna Akhmatova, and this was rumored to be an affair, although she always denied that, and also with Marina Tsvetaeva. That may or may not have been an affair, hard to say, but they both wrote a lot of poetry to each other at this time, and if you're interested, you can read the poems that they wrote to, for, and about each other. Unlike, for example, Blok or Mayakovsky, Mandelstam was not a big supporter of the Soviet regime, but he remained in the Soviet Union and was allowed to keep working there in the 1920s and was able to publish some of his work, although not a huge amount. His second major poetry collection, Tristia, was actually published in 1922 in Berlin, so it had to be published abroad rather than in the Soviet Union. This was also when he married his wife Nadezhda in 1922, and this turned out to be a fateful marriage, not because it was so terribly happy, it wasn't, but because Nadezhda, despite his difficult behavior and his tendency to chase other women, she remained very faithful to his art. And as we'll hear later, she carefully preserved his poetry when it seemed likely that it would all be destroyed. Throughout the 1920s, he continued writing, but was not able to publish very much of his poetry. He was able to publish Tristia in Berlin in 1922. He was able to bring out another edition of Kamen, but mainly he earned money and worked as a writer by working as a translator and a journalist. And if you remember, the 1920s was a very turbulent and changing time in the Soviet Union. It started off with a fair amount of social, cultural, and artistic freedom, and then there was more and more repression, especially after Lenin's death and Stalin's rise to power. And so in the early 20s, Mandelstam was able to publish some poetry. By the late 20s, he was having more and more trouble. As I said, Mandelstam was getting into more and more trouble as the Soviet regime became more oppressive. I remember hearing a story about him that he saw some Chekisti. The Cheka was the predecessor to the NKVD and then the KGB, now the FSB. He saw some Chekisti with piles of blank arrest and death warrants. So the Chekisti were sent out with quotas, and they just had to go and grab people to fulfill their arrest and execution quotas. And so they would just go out and grab people, and maybe you were guilty of something. A lot of times you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they had a quota to fill. So the story I heard was that he saw some Chekisti sitting in a cafe with a pile of blank arrest and execution warrants, kind of laughing about it, and he walked up and grabbed the warrants and tore them up. I'd like to think that's true, although I'm kind of surprised that he wasn't arrested for that. That was not what he was arrested for. The thing that he was arrested for was writing an anti-Stalin poem, which he read to a small circle of friends. So he did this in 1933. Things weren't as bad as they would be 5 years later, but they were already pretty bad. And so, for example, Pasternak, the poet Pasternak, who also wrote Dr. Zhivago, heard about this poem and said, "This isn't poetry, this is suicide. Don't tell me about it. You didn't tell me anything and I didn't hear anything, and such a poem does not exist." Nonetheless, Mandelstam did perform this poem to a small circle of friends, one of whom denounced him, and he was arrested in 1934 and exiled. And he was exiled to the Perm region at first, and certainly it could have been much worse, but it must have been pretty bad. He did attempt suicide while he was there, but he was unsuccessful. And due to the intercession of his wife Nadezhda, he was later allowed to move from the Perm region to Voronezh. And he finished his period of exile in 1937 and was allowed to leave the Voronezh region. However, things continued to go downhill for him. Shortly after he was released from exile, he was told that he would be allowed to come to Moscow, and he did, and then he was promptly arrested in early 1938 for being in the Moscow region without permission, even though he had permission. So he was arrested again, and he was convicted of a number of things, including anti-Soviet activity, and this time he was sentenced to hard labor. And you can see the difference between the two arrest photos. On the previous slide was his arrest photo from 1934, and he has this kind of jaunty, cocky expression on his face, and he's got his arms folded like, ha, you can't knock me down. And in the arrest photo on this slide from 1938, he looks much grimmer. And he was right to look grim. Things were not looking good for anyone in 1938, and particularly not for him. He was sentenced to hard labor and sent to the Far East. The journey was very taxing, and he became very weak and eventually died in a transit camp in December 1938. We didn't actually know what had happened to him until recently, until the KGB opened a lot of its files. He died, like I said, in this transit camp, and he was buried in a mass grave there, and for a long time, we didn't know what happened to him, only that he disappeared en route to hard labor in the Far East and was never found again. But we have since found out what happened to him, which was pretty much what everyone thought had happened to him. Like many writers of his era, Mandelstam's life thus had a very tragic arc to it. Most of the writers we're going to see from this era ended their lives one way or another in the 1930s and 40s. The exception, of course, was Akhmatova, but she had plenty of other problems with her husband's execution and her son's many arrests. So while Mandelstam had this tragic outcome to his life, he left an enduring literary legacy and has become one of the most popular and well-known Russian poets of the 20th century, both in Russia and the West. A lot of credit for that is due to his wife, Nadezhda Mandelstam, who memorized a lot of his poetry by heart. And so instead of committing it to paper, she was able to commit it to memory and preserve it for posterity when it could be published again after Stalin's death. As I mentioned in the introduction, Mandelstam was both one of the founders of Acmeism and one of the first major Jewish writers in Russian literature. Even if his topic matter was not particularly Jewish, the very fact that he was of Jewish descent marked him as someone who had to overcome all of the barriers placed in his way to even be allowed to go to school and to write and publish. And he was able to do that and founded this new and very exciting, if short-lived, literary movement of Acmeism, and basically defined it both through his poetry, especially in the collection Stone or Common, and his prose. He wrote The Morning of Acmeism, Utra Acmeisma, which was a major defining text for describing what Acmeism was. And he became, like Akhmatova, his fellow Acmeist, he became a kind of a cultural icon or cultural touchstone during his life. And even when his poetry could not be published, people still memorized it. Just like with Akhmatova, he would give private readings. People would memorize his poetry in secret. And he was this influential and beloved figure in Russian cultural life, even after he was no longer able to publish his poetry. He also became widely translated and published in the West. And so the other major poet that many Western readers are familiar with is Mandelstam. And it's sort of an interesting question of why Mandelstam and Akhmatova instead of, for example, Blok and Tsvetaeva or Mayakovsky and Tsvetaeva. Again, part of it was probably politics, the fact that he remained in Russia but nonetheless did not support the Soviet regime made him look good to both Russian and Western readers and made it more likely that Westerners would publish his work because it was seen as anti-Soviet, even if it had no actual anti-Soviet obvious theme to it. And he did, in fact, try to write a pro-Stalin poem called Ode to Stalin that did not really work out either as a work of art or as an attempt to save his life. But like Akhmatova, he was determined to stay in Russia and was willing to try and work with the regime at least a little bit in order to stay in Russia and stay alive. Unfortunately for him, it didn't work. But the fact that he was seen as a dissident probably helped with his publication in the West. Like Akhmatova, his literary style is very simple and straightforward, deceptively simple and straightforward. We shouldn't think that what he was doing was easy or easily copied, because it wasn't. No one has been able to copy Mandelstam and achieve the heights of what he did, but his style translates well in a way that, for example, Tsvetaeva or Mayakovsky don't translate as well, especially Tsvetaeva. So that's another thing about him and why we read him so much in the West. He just translates well. I hope you found this overview of his life helpful. One of the things about his life is that he, like, for example, Mayakovsky, predicted in some way some of the things that would happen to him. And so when you read his poetry, keep his life arc in mind and think about how his poetry had this prophetic power to it in some ways. We're not reading a lot of his poems that turn out to have a prophetic aspect to it, but there are some that you might think of as prophetic, and you can just keep that in mind as you read them.